In Chapter 13, we'll look at how populations evolve and the scientists who came up with the theory of evolution. This week, we'll spend most of our time around the population level. In a population, organisms of one type are interacting, living, and breeding together. That is the recipe or the basis for all evolutionary processes. A population is a group of one kind of species in a given area that is capable of breeding. And, importantly, they must breed and create fertile offspring that can then pass their traits down through the different generations. The exemption from this are those non-sterile hybrids. They provide, no passing of genetics beyond their generation. Examples are things like mules, zonkies, tigons, and ligers, all crosses of species that are artificially done by us. Remember that evolution works at the population level because it's all of the genes in a given population that are inferring whether each individual has an enhanced survivability and reproductive capacity to then pass those individual traits down to the next generation. Remember the difference between phenotype and genotype. Genotype are the actual genes, or I should say allele combinations. They are the raw material that give us the different phenotypes, physical expressions. When we're thinking of evolution and increased survivability and reproduction, it is those phenotypes and genotypes that, could make or break whether you survive and reproduce. Genetic information is that important raw material that evolution is really working on. Think of the different ways in which we get variation in populations. Things like mutations, microevolution, which are the change in allele frequencies, sexual reproduction, crossing two sources of DNA, and then two others we haven't talked about, genetic drift and genetic flow, which are basically populations that are shifting due to their size or movement. At its most basic definition, evolution is just change over time. And we can look at it in two different levels, macro and micro. Both can produce changes, but it's just the scope that we're looking at. In microevolution, we're down there looking at the DNA, at the alleles, and how that changes frequencies from population to population over the generations. Macroevolution is the larger scale. What is the overall phenotype that is the result of those genes, and how do those physical traits appear to change over time? Most students have heard of Charles Darwin as the father of evolution. He is credited with coming up with the actual theory, though he didn't call it the theory of evolution. Most students aren't aware of Alfred Wallace, who, at the very same time that Darwin was coming up with his ideas, Wallace was also discovering and putting together the same ideas. The two collaborated later in life and together championed four major points. Number one, that individuals within a population vary from each other, so that there's genetic variation within populations. Number two, that species are able to basically over-reproduce, have more children than can survive. Therefore, those that do survive are the lucky ones. In essence, the ones that get to have traits that inferred some survival advantage, and then they can pass those on to their offspring. Step 3 is that of those that survived, they represent only a subset of the genetics that used to be in a population. So differential survival from number 2 leads to differential reproduction in number 3. Both of these accumulate generation after generation into, well, favorable traits or adaptations that hopefully makes an animal, a plant, or whatever organism we're looking at better adapted to its environment. Darwin wrote in 1859 on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. What does that mean? Well, we boil it down into natural selection being the mechanism, the how of the evolutionary process. That selection occurs at the levels of the individual, but it's expressed at the level of the population because it is what subset of the entire population that survives and reproduces. And that selection has no endpoint. You don't just stop evolving because you know what? Environments are always changing. Animals, plants, everyone is always having to adapt, or at least potentially adapt. Lastly is the term survival of the fittest. Surely you've heard that one, but fittest might be what you think of. For most people, the term survival of the fittest means how strong you are. How much can you bench press, or just overall strength. But fitness in this case is basically an estimate of the number of genes or specific traits, alleles, that you have and are passing down to the next generation. The term fitness actually comes from, well, math, and it actually has a formula, a way to calculate it. In evolution, though, we're looking at what are those traits that enable you to survive and reproduce, and those that are passed to the next generation, well, we count those as a measure of fitness. So survival of individuals that survive and reproduce better than other individuals, that's what fitness is all about. We'll look at several different lineages of evidence that show evolutionary process in the making through time and in current. Fossils, both living and non-living, give us actual proof of organisms that lived historically. We can dig them up, compare them, measure them, analyze them, age date them, and they can yield a wonderful array of information. In the lower two pictures, the one on the left shows the distribution of fossils of several different organisms. Notice that they represent habitats in which those animals lived and survived and even reproduced for a period of time, which then abruptly changed, and hence they became fossils. Now you'll notice that their fossil remains are spread between different continents. And this shows us that, well, the environment, the places of land masses, everything has been shifting for hundreds of millions of years. In the right-hand figure, you can see the evolutionary changes that took place sequentially in the fossil record from fossils that we've dug up right here in Oregon. The John Day fossil beds are a wealth of information, and they show a rich history of the gradual changes that took place in the body form of the modern-day horse. Its closest ancestors resembled more like a little deer, but we can trace through what are called transitional fossils each of the subsequent steps that took place to yield this modern body form. Biogeography is the marriage of biology with geography to explain the bodies and adaptations that occurred in modern-day descendants and trace it back to their ancestors. In the example below, you'll see camels, and note that different camel species or family members exist in Africa, Asia, and South America. Although the ones in South America we don't call camels. The origins of this group were ancient camels that actually originated right here in North America. There's fossils of them over there in the John Day fossil bed. So camels originated in North America and dispersed westward across a land bridge that developed between Alaska and Siberia to disperse into Asia and Africa. Another group went south through Central America and into South America. Each of these three distinct locations have very different habitat types. So the bodies of these ancestral camels were having to adapt in different ways to different local conditions. So what we end up with are things like the dromedary camels of Africa, the bactrian camels of Asia, and a group that diverged so much that they don't even look like camels anymore. And in fact, we don't even call them camels. They are now the llamas, the alpacas, the vicuñas, and their kin. Comparative anatomy is looking at the adult structures and how they compare with other organisms and in relation to those that may share ancestry. In the figure below, you're looking at homologous structures. Structures we have, and they're the same because we've shared ancestry, though they might be slightly modified for the way in which they're used. The example here is the arm. Note we have a human, cat, whale, and bat all having the same bone design in the arms. The one bone, two bone, wrist, hand bones are all the same, including 5 digits. But what's different is, well, you modify them slightly for your way of life. Bats have very elongated phalanges so that they can flap their wings. Whales have reduced the arms, elongated 2 of the fingers, and wrapped the entire thing into a flipper. So these structures are homologous. They have the same structure because we share that from our ancestry. Another category are vestigial traits. These are traits we no longer use, but we have them because, well, they're vestiges of our ancestry. Can you think of some? Most people think of the appendix in humans, but also the wisdom teeth. If anything, they generally cause us more harm because our jaws have gotten smaller and we no longer have room for them. We also find vestigial traits in animals that are highly modified, meaning they really wouldn't use these. Whales with pelvic bones, and even snakes with pelvic bones and rudimentary hind limbs. They never protrude externally, so why even build them in the first place if you're never going to use them? Well, because they're genetically programmed to. It's part of their ancestral lineage. A special category is diving in and comparing the embryos and looking at the developmental stages of different organisms. It's quite unique as we all start as a zygote, the fusion of sperm and egg, but the stages in which we pass through on our way to, well, developing into the animals we are, is quite unique but yet shared in many ways. Vertebrate animals in particular have a great number of developmental stages that they share. It turns out those developmental stages are genetically derived and they do fall along family lineages. The more closely related families are, the greater their embryos are through the early stages, only diverging late into the individual body forms that we see on this slide. Lastly is molecular biology, and I've kind of mentioned this along the way, and that's really diving into our genes and the proteins that they produce. Remember that genetically we pass down our DNA to our offspring, and that from generation to generation we should share a greater number of genetic components. But that also that those genes are coding for proteins, and so the greater similarities in our proteins also show relatedness. Ultimately, it is the production of proteins that go on to build structures or drive our metabolisms or the way in which we live. Those are the manifesting physical traits that we see that are helping organisms to adapt to their environments. Remember that the more genetically related you are, the more you shared an ancestor close in time. The Galapagos Islands are a group of volcanic islands sitting roughly 560 miles off the coast of Ecuador. What's important is that these not only were one of the great sources of inspiration for Darwin, but that their volcanic origins give us clues to the actual natural selection process. A few individuals likely found their way to the islands early on in the form of finches. These finches made it to the islands and started to survive there and reproduce there. They started to adapt to each of the local conditions. The Galapagos Islands is made of 13 large islands and about 6 small ones. Each has a very different habitat type. The plants that have managed to establish themselves there are quite varied as well. So each finch type is highly adapted for its particular niche. Today we have over 14 species that originated from one ancestral group that made their way to the island. We see natural selection happening every day in bacteria's ability to, well, become resistant to our antibiotics. So think about when you take an antibiotic. The goal is to kill off the bacteria that are making you sick. But generally speaking, you're not going to kill 100% because there are mutations, especially mutations that are in those plasmids, that are passed from one bacteria to all of its binary fissioned offspring. So by taking antibiotics and killing a portion of the population, another portion is left to survive and reproduce. If that occurs over several cycles, the resulting sort of generations downstream can be uniquely different than the original bacterial population. That's evolution, and natural selection is working on them in real time inside our bodies. The idea of natural selection came to both Darwin and Wallace through a process that they were both very familiar with, artificial selection. We are choosy about what we breed together and the resulting offspring that we get. We see artificial selection all around us, since we do it for all of our crops and our domesticated animals. Now look at the examples here. In the wild mustard, we have been able to selectively breed through our choosing of specific traits, everything from cauliflower and broccoli to kale and When Darwin put his idea of natural selection together, he had, well, a few frustrations. And some of them are traits like you see here in the peacock. How could natural selection, which is driving for best adaptations, survival, and reproduction, end up with a bird with a huge tail feathers as big as a peacock? Until sexual selection was developed as a theory, sexual selection is yet another type of selective process. But in this case, it's the females choosing particular traits in their mates that are driving, well, adaptations that might not be really good for their survival. It is true, though, that a male peacock has to be old enough, have enough nutrients, food source, good genetic stock, in order to grow that long of a tail, as well as evade predators while flying around with those huge tails. So that infers the size of those large trains or tail feathers is an estimate of how good his fitness is, how good of genes might he have inside. Now, whether we're talking about natural selection, artificial selection, even sexual, different patterns result from those selective processes. Three general patterns are defined here in these slides. They are stabilizing, directional, and disruptive. Now, to begin, a graph below is showing you sort of the average distribution of some trait, where we have lots in the middle and fewer in the population having the polar sides. Stabilizing selection is a selective process that takes place where the extremes on both sides are basically less favored, selected against. They have less survival, and so better survival if you're in the middle. The middle, that stabilized middle section, really represents traits that make you more adapted. Perhaps this means you're more camouflaged. If you were too light or too dark, you wouldn't match the habitat. We see that in a lot of insects, like moths. In humans, birth weight is fairly stabilized. Until modern medicine, extreme preemies and very overweight babies generally didn't survive as well. We have widened out the curve due to medicine, but our birth rates are still fairly tight. In directional selection, basically the selective forces are favoring one of the extremes. So the entire population is sort of genetically driven to one side of the graph. Perhaps it is a color pattern at one end, or some other survivability trait, such as resistance genes. Think about a population of bacteria having a wide variety of genetic variation. Once subjected to antibiotics, well, we're selecting for only those with the resistant genes to be survivors. Everybody else dies out. That is definitely directional selection. The last one is disruptive, and disruptive is a kind of special case where the intermediate is basically selected against. It is the both extremes that seem to be better survivors and reproducing and passing those traits down. So there's not as many examples of this because it has to happen in one general environment. The best known example is in New Mexico, down around the White Sands National Parks, where we have dark colored rocks and lighter colored sand blowing in and amongst the rocks. What has happened is we have both lizards and rodents, called rock pocket mice, that come in light and dark colorations. The light-colored animals do best in the sandy environment. The dark-colored animals do best on the rocks. But they do often interbreed. Rock pocket mice, light and dark, breed and make an intermediate colored rock pocket mouse. Well, those offspring, they don't match either types of the sand or the rocks, and generally predators eat them first. They're more obvious. That same hybridization takes place in lizards, and it's those hybrid lizards that just get eaten. So this is driving two populations, basically a light and a dark, and over time could actually split these into two different species, a process known as speciation.